immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening diagonals for bishops and the queen. Instantly claiming queenside space, this Sicilian defense immediately creates an unbalanced and fighting game. Developing a knight here prepares to contest the center and keeps options open for pawn structure. Opening the diagonal for the bishop and preparing a solid pawn chain, this establishes a strong foothold against white's central ambitions. Opening the center immediately invites sharp exchanges and demands precise calculation from both sides. Exchanging pawns here opens the c-file for immediate counterplay and challenges white's central pawn majority, creating dynamic imbalances. Opening the center, white seizes the initiative and establishes a strong central pawn presence, aiming for rapid development. Challenging the knight's dominion, this develops a piece and prepares castling while maintaining central pressure. Reinforcing e4 prepares a kingside pawn storm and secures the d4 knight, though it limits the bishop's development. Solidifying the pawn chain, this move prepares to develop the bishop and contest the center, a sensible response to white's slightly passive pawn advance. Asserting central dominion, c4* aims to solidify white's pawn wedge and limit black's potential piece activity, especially on the queen side, while also preparing for a potential queenside pawn expansion to seize more territory. Developing the bishop to this square secures a safe retreat if the center becomes too volatile and prepares for castling, a vital step in safeguarding the king, while also preparing to contest the dark squares. Developing the knight to its natural square solidifies the pawn center and prepares for castling, while keeping options open for further queenside expansion. Castling secures the king, creating a safe haven and preparing to connect the rooks for future action on the central files. Developing the bishop to e3 solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares for a kingside fianchetto or a potential queenside castling. It also adds pressure to the d6 pawn, subtly influencing black's pawn breaks. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies central influence and prepares for potential pawn advances, while subtly creating a more robust defensive structure for the king. The queen, now actively participating, aims to connect the rooks and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn structure against any immediate knight incursions. Challenging the center with vigor, black aims to immediately disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for their pieces. This bold thrust seeks to complicate the position, forcing white to confront the central tension directly rather than consolidating their space. Opening the center with this exchange immediately unlocks tactical possibilities and forces black to confront the unleashed pawn majority. The immediate consequence is the creation of an open file for your rook, potentially eyeing weak squares or pressuring black's uncastled king if an escape route isn't found quickly. This is not just about pawn structure. It's about controlling the dynamic of the game and seizing the initiative. Opening the center with this capture immediately offers a strategic crossroads, forcing a positional decision regarding pawn structure and piece activity. Castling queenside initiates a sharp positional battle, aiming to exploit the open central files and pressure black's somewhat exposed king. Challenging the central control and aiming for a foothold on the queenside, this knight maneuver immediately injects dynamic tension into the position, forcing white to reconsider their pawn structure and the safety of their monarch. Disrupting the central pawn structure now sacrifices immediate control of the d5 square, aiming to unlock diagonals and create opportunities for white's pieces to penetrate the kingside once black's central defenses solidify. Nabbing the central pawn with the knight immediately reignites the battle for control of the d5 square, creating dynamic possibilities. Black's knight, now actively placed, eyes potential weaknesses in white's queenside pawn structure and could soon participate in an attack on the king. This maneuver also opens up lines for black's queenside pieces, hinting at future attacking thrusts. Probing into the queenside with the knight, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses on the b-file. This knight maneuver could also be a prelude to repositioning it to a more active square, perhaps c7, to eye black's king if it remains castled kingside. Consider how this aggressive forward thrust might force black to reevaluate their defensive setup and potentially make concessions. Boldly challenging the knight's dominion, this capture liberates black's bishop and initiates a dynamic pawn exchange, aiming to disrupt white's castle and create complications around their isolated d-pawn. Reclaiming the central pawn and opening the queen's diagonal towards the kingside presents an immediate tactical threat, potentially destabilizing black's castled position if not handled with utmost care. Unleashing a knight into an active square, the bishop eyes the queen, aiming to disrupt white's castled king's safety by creating immediate pressure. Unleashing a pawn storm to seize initiative, white bravely ventures f4, igniting a fierce battle for central control and attacking the exposed black bishop on g5. Probing the weakened king's defenses, this maneuver immediately challenges white's rook on the d-file and prepares to exploit the rather uncoordinated placement of white's knights. Black seeks to disrupt white's central control and create imbalances, potentially leading to a favorable exchange or a direct attack on the monarch. The tension on the d-file is now paramount. Instead of consolidating the center or developing the bishop, white redirects the queen to a square that was just vacated, potentially setting up a tempo gain against the knight or preparing to contest the d-file. Reinforcing the central pawns and preparing a rook lift to the kingside suggests black is anticipating a strategic battle for control of key squares, potentially aiming to outmaneuver white's slightly exposed king. Disrupting the queenside pawn structure with this forced exchange now prioritizes activity on the open files and aims to exploit black's exposed king. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, ushering in an endgame where black's bishop on g5, though actively placed, now faces a potentially cramped situation with a closed pawn structure. Exchanging the queens here throws the game into a simplified endgame where the pawn structure and piece activity will dictate the outcome, forcing black to be particularly mindful of the open files and white's looming central control. Black voluntarily enters a queenless middle game that looks quite difficult, having exchanged off their active queen for white's much less impressive knight on d8, and now finds themselves in a position where their king is still exposed on the dark squares, especially after the pawn thrusts that opened lines towards it. The bishop on d3 now eyes the b5 square, potentially disrupting black's coordination and hinting at a queenside pawn advance. Developing the bishop to d7 offers a solid defensive posture, anchoring the pawn chain and preparing to re-enter the game, while simultaneously acknowledging the recent queen trade's implications for the central pawn structure. Clearing the d-file now allows white to activate the rook on the open highway, aiming to contest black's remaining bishop pair advantage and potentially disrupt the king's safety in the long run, while the d-pawn's absence also simplifies the central pawn structure. The bishop's immediate danger on d7, being pinned to the rook and now under fire from the rook on d1, prompts a reactive defense, but unfortunately it sacrifices vital pawn structure and allows white to seize the initiative along the open d-file, creating a decisive queenside majority. The knight lunges forward, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. Black's bishop on c7 now assumes a crucial defensive post, anchoring the queenside pawns and preparing for potential pawn advances like b5, while simultaneously eyeing the weakened light squares on the kingside now that the white queen is gone from d2 and d8. Reclaiming central presence, white endeavors to establish a more commanding outpost for the bishop, aiming to restrict black's queenside mobility and prepare for a potential pawn advance. The rook reestablishes its presence on the open d-file, a vital territorial claim in this endgame scenario. 23 b4. Asserting dominion over the queenside, this pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's bishop, forcing a reaction and potentially opening new avenues for white's rooks. It's a strategic gamble aimed at disrupting black's rather passive rook placement and creating space for white's pieces to operate more freely. The immediate consequence is a restriction on the black knight's potential squares and a subtle but persistent pressure on black's queenside structure. Consider how this pawn's advance might pave the way for a future a4-a5 push, further cramping black's queenside. Challenging the advanced bishop on g4 injects a jolt of activity into this endgame, aiming to disrupt white's relatively harmonious piece placement. Black seeks to exchange off this influential defender and potentially create weaknesses in white's pawn structure by forcing concessions. This proactive stance could lead to a more dynamic struggle, where black attempts to leverage piece activity over white's slight material advantage. Clearing the queenside's positional bottleneck, this pawn grab immediately opens new attacking avenues and eliminates black's active bishop pair, creating an imbalance that white can exploit by targeting the now exposed kingside pawns and potential weaknesses in the pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight fundamentally alters the endgame landscape, trading a potent attacking piece for a defender. This immediately opens the door for white's passed pawn on the queenside to become a significant threat, while black's central pawn structure becomes somewhat fragmented, creating potential weaknesses that can be exploited. Consider the long-term implications of this material imbalance and how it impacts your piece activity in the coming moves. Instantly seize the open file, pushing black's isolated pawn to the brink and initiating a potent rook maneuver that aims to penetrate the final ranks. A risky gambit of piece activity for positional confinement, hoping to exploit white's exposed monarch and potentially create a passed pawn out of thin air, even at the cost of sacrificing material and sacrificing control of key diagonals. Reclaiming the central squares and preparing to exploit the isolated pawn on a6 marks a significant shift in white's plan, aiming to create active piece play through the open files now available. Capitalizing on the doubled pawns, this capture introduces a completely new endgame dynamic, forcing white to reconsider their piece placement and potentially creating opportunities for black's rook on the now open file. Opening a diagonal for the rook and threatening the bishop, this pawn thrust injects dynamism into a position that was becoming somewhat static, forcing black to immediately address the looming danger to their bishop. Asserting presence on the light squares, the bishop aims to disrupt white's coordination, eyeing the vulnerable pawn on f5 and potentially forcing further pawn structure concessions to alleviate black's slightly cramped position. Reclaiming the f-file for your rook opens up aggressive possibilities, potentially targeting the pawn on f7 or creating a passed pawn if the opportunity arises. This is a proactive step to re-energize your attack after black's tenacious defense. Dislodging that well-posted bishop from its commanding central outpost is the immediate priority, forcing it to retreat and potentially creating weaknesses in its defensive structure. Instigating a pawn storm on the kingside with that knight advance could be a clever maneuver, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black monarch and disrupt the pawn structure, potentially opening lines for the rook and the lone bishop. A daring repositioning of the bishop, this piece now aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially activate itself on the queenside, seeking counterplay where none seemed readily available. Unleashing a powerful pawn advance to lock down the queenside and create a strong outpost for the knight. Black's bishop, now eyeing the weakened kingside thanks to white's pushed pawns, finds a provocative perch, potentially disrupting white's defensive structure and threatening to tie down valuable pieces. Unleashing the rook to its maximum potential, this aggressive repositioning aims to exploit the exposed black king and create immediate mating threats. Repositioning the rook to the open file, the defender now eyes the vulnerable enemy king's defenses and aims to participate in the pawn structure's skirmish. Moving the king to d2 initiates a crucial repositioning, aiming to dislodge the troublesome black bishop that has been a thorn in white's side, potentially opening lines for the rook and activating the king for the ensuing endgame. An opportunistic thrust, aiming to disrupt white's potentially dominant rook placement and gain some breathing room by forcing exchanges in the center, though it risks opening the f-file for the opponent's rook if white reacts with precise calculation. The king's journey from the safety of the castled position into the heart of the battlefield, a bold gamble to activate its defensive potential by participating in pawn structure reinforcement, now faces a stark reality of exposed vulnerability. A king unescorted by its own army leaves it susceptible to the swift and decisive maneuvers of the opponent's active pieces, potentially leading to a rapid collapse of the remaining defensive fortifications and an accelerated endgame defeat. Securing the king with this maneuver prioritizes immediate safety, a wise decision given the exposed nature of Black's monarch, effectively preventing any immediate tactical threats from White's reinforced queenside pawns and bishop. The White monarch boldly ventures into the heart of the remaining enemy forces, initiating a daring centralization that seeks to disrupt Black's somewhat passive peace arrangement and contest the crucial central squares. Exploiting the king's exposed position, Black forces a decisive exchange that will simplify into a winning endgame by immediately exposing White's monarch to further checks. This recapture immediately simplifies the position, ushering in a pawn-up endgame where Black's isolated queen's rook pawn on the queenside becomes a prime target. Accepting the exchange solidifies a queen's pawn endgame, but more importantly, it releases Black's rook to a much more active square, now aiming directly at White's awkward bishop. The White monarch, now liberated, ventures towards the center, aiming to support its remaining pawns and become an active participant in the endgame, a crucial shift from its prior defensive confinement. The monarch steps out, aiming to shepherd the remaining pawns, a common endgame endeavor to activate the king and challenge the opponent's unsupported foot soldiers. The king cautiously ventures out, seeking sanctuary and aiming to centralize for the inevitable pawn race that will decide this endgame. A crucial decision point in this endgame. Relocating the king to the center is an attempt to gain influence and perhaps support past pawns, but it exposes the monarch to potential checks and skirmishes along the open files. Initiating pawn advances on the king side can often be a double-edged sword, potentially creating weaknesses while seeking to gain space and create threats. A subtle yet vital defensive maneuver. This pawn advances to create an escape square for the king, preventing a potential pawn push from the opponent that could trap the monarch and lead to immediate material loss or a critical positional disadvantage in the endgame. Advancing the pawn like this begins to hem in the Black king, creating a necessary pawn chain that might restrict its mobility in the coming endgame stages. Consolidating the pawn structure on the king side becomes paramount now, with the central files opened and the opponent's king appearing relatively safe. Pushing this pawn allows for potential breakthroughs and restricts White's pieces from gaining a foothold on the king's defense. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now prevents Black from activating their pawn and offers a subtle advantage by restricting the opponent's counterplay. Securing the pawn chain's base and preparing to advance the kingside majority provides a crucial foothold, aiming to disrupt White's consolidated pawn structure and create a passed pawn of its own. The king ventures out, seeking to dominate the central expanse and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. Driving the king forward now, the Black monarch plunges into the center, aiming to seize crucial squares and disrupt White's potential pawn advances by creating an active presence.